The dust of Redemption Creek tasted of grit and failed promises. It settled in the lines of Alara Hayes's hands, on the hem of her simple calico dress, and in the back of her throat a constant dry reminder of where she was. At 19, she felt the town's name was a cruel joke. There was no redemption here, only the slow grind of survival under a sun that baked the cracked earth until it split open like a wound. She stood inside the Redemption Creek Bank, a squat wooden building that smelled of oiled leather and old paper clutching a small canvas pouch. The coins inside were for supplies, a mundane errand on a brutally mundane day. Through the grimy window, the main street shimmered in the midday heat. A dog slept in the sliver of shade offered by the gallows, a permanent fixture in the town square. Everything was still caught in the breathless pause before a storm. The storm broke not with thunder, but with the splintering crash of the bank's door being kicked from its hinges. 3 men burst in their faces, hidden by dusty bandanas, their movements sharp and predatory. The air, once thick with heat, was now electric with fear. The bank teller, a young man named Thomas, with a perpetually nervous twitch, threw his hands into the air so fast he nearly lost his balance. The only other customer, a grizzled prospector, dropped to the floor with a grunt. Alara froze her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had heard stories of outlaws, but they were campfire tales, distant and unreal. This was real. The smell of gun oil and unwashed bodies filled the small room. The leader stepped forward, moving with an unnerving grace. He was taller than the others, his duster hanging from broad shoulders. He didn't shout or swagger. He simply held a Colt revolver with a steadiness that was more terrifying than any threat. "The safe, Thomas." The leader set his voice a low, calm rumble that cut through the panic. "No need for heroics today." Thomas, pale and shaking, fumbled with the combination lock on the large iron safe. While one of the other men began stuffing loose bills into a sack, the leader's eyes scanned the room. They were dark and intelligent, and when they landed on Alara, she felt a cold dread snake down her spine. He took a step toward her, his spurs jingling softly, a sound that would echo in her nightmares for weeks to come. She clutched her pouch of coins tighter, a pathetic offering. But he wasn't looking at the money. His gaze was fixed on her throat. "Well, well," he murmured, his voice laced with a strange, almost gentle curiosity. He reached out, not with the hand holding the gun, but with his other. Alara flinched back, but his fingers were quick, hooking onto the delicate silver chain around her neck. "What have we here?" Hanging from the chain was a small, oval-shaped silver locket tarnished with age. It was worn smooth from years of touch, its surface etched with a simple floral pattern. It was the only thing she had left of her mother, who had died of fever when Alara was just a child. It held no monetary value, but to Alara it was everything. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was my mother's." The leader paused. For a moment, his dark eyes seemed to soften, and a flicker of something regret crossed his face. He held the locket in his palm, his thumb tracing the worn engraving. The moment stretched a fragile bubble of stillness in the middle of the chaos. He looked from the locket back to her face, a question in his eyes she couldn't comprehend. Then, with a sharp tug that stung her skin, he snapped the chain. The bubble burst. He curled his fingers around the locket, tucking it into his vest pocket as if it were the most valuable thing in the room. She shouldn't have had it, he said, his voice losing its softness, replaced by a chilling finality. The other outlaws were finished. They backed toward the door, their guns still trained on the terrified occupants. The leader gave Alara one last lingering look, a look that felt disturbingly personal, as if he knew her, as if this act was not random at all. Then he turned and was gone, vanishing into the blinding sunlight, leaving behind a shattered door, a robbed bank, in a silence that screamed louder than the chaos that had preceded it. Elara stood trembling, her hand instinctively flying to her neck, her fingers closing around the empty space where the locket had been. The violation felt deeper than the theft of money. It was a theft of memory, of connection, of the last tangible piece of her mother she had. And in the chilling quiet of the bank, a single burning question took root in her heart. Why? Why had he taken that specific locket? Who was this man who looked at her as if he knew her deepest secrets? His name, she would soon learn, was Silas Blackwood. And his arrival in Redemption Creek was not the end of a robbery, but the beginning of a reckoning. In the days that followed, Redemption Creek simmered. The town was a raw scar on the landscape, carved out of dust and determination. Its buildings were unpainted pine, its fences were crooked, and its spirit was a fragile thing easily fractured. The sun bled across the horizon each evening, painting the mesas in shades of fire and blood, a daily spectacle that felt more like a warning than a promise. The air carried the scent of dust horse manure and the faint, sweet smell of piñon smoke from the distant Apache camps nestled in the foothills. This was Elara's world, a place of stark contrasts and unspoken tensions. The settlers, led by men like her father, Jedediah Hayes, clung to order and scripture, their fear of the untamed wilderness, manifesting as a rigid distrust of their Apache neighbors. The Apache, led by a stoic warrior named Cale, watched the encroaching fences and the scarring of the earth with a quiet, simmering resentment. They had lived on this land for generations, their lives woven into its rhythms, and they saw the settlers not as pioneers, but as invaders. Elara's life was as tightly fenced as her father's property. Jedediah Hayes was the town's founder and wealthiest citizen, a man whose reputation was built on a foundation of unyielding piety and shrewd business sense. His home was the largest in Redemption Creek, a two-story structure that stood as a monument to his success. But inside its walls, the air was cold. Jedediah ruled his household with the same iron will he used to rule his business dealings. He saw Elara not as a daughter to be cherished, but as a reflection of his own honor, an asset to be protected, polished, and eventually married off to strengthen his standing. Their relationship was a desert of unspoken words. He had never recovered from his wife's death, sealing his grief behind a wall of stern authority. He expected obedience, not affection, and Elara had learned long ago that her own thoughts and feelings were unwelcome. The memory of her mother was a ghost between them, for him a source of private pain he refused to acknowledge. For her, a fading warmth she clung to through the silver locket. Now even that was gone. The robbery had left a wound in the town's psyche, but it was Elara's personal loss that festered. Sheriff Miller, a man whose authority was mostly symbolic, had made a half-hearted attempt to form a posse. It had returned 2 days later, dusty and defeated, having lost Blackwood's trail in the labyrinthine canyons to the north. "He's a ghost, Missy," the sheriff had told her, tipping his hat with weary resignation. Best to forget it. He's long gone by now. But Elara couldn't forget. The image of Silas Blackwood's eyes, the feel of his fingers on her skin, the chilling finality of his words. She shouldn't have had it, haunted her waking hours and stalked her dreams. It wasn't just a robbery. It was a message, one she was desperate to understand. Her world, once defined by predictable routines, now felt like a cage. The creak of the saloon doors, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the judgmental glances of the townswomen, every sound and sight seemed to mock her helplessness. She felt a restlessness she had never known, a deep, abiding anger that her father's rigid world had no place for. Her mother, in quiet defiance of Jedediah's pragmatism, had taught Elara the names of the wild herbs, how to read the clouds for rain, and how to follow the tracks of a jackrabbit. They were small secret skills whispers of a wilder world beyond the fences. And now they felt like the only tools she had left. The confrontation came a week after the robbery, during a supper shrouded in suffocating silence. The clinking of forks against porcelain was the only sound in the cavernous dining room. Jedediah sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of stern disapproval, as if her very presence was an affront to his dignity. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, Alara put down her fork. "Sheriff Miller has given up," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "He said there's nothing more he can do." Jedediah didn't look up from his plate. Sheriff Miller is a sensible man. Silas Blackwood is not some common horse thief. He is a phantom. Chasing him is a fool's errand. He stole Mother's locket. Alara pressed her hands, balling into fists in her lap. "He took it from my neck. It wasn't about the money, Father. It was personal." At the mention of his wife, Jedediah's jaw tightened. He finally raised his eyes, and they were as cold and hard as river stones. "It's just a trinket, Alara, an object. Your sentimentality is a weakness. You are safe. The money stolen from the bank is insured. The matter is closed. We will speak of it no more." His dismissal was like a slap. He was erasing her mother, erasing her grief, erasing the violation she felt ought to preserve his precious, orderly world. A fire she didn't know she possessed flared in her chest. "It was hers, Father," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. "I can't." "You can, and you will," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. "Your duty is to this family, to its honor. You will not tarnish our name by chasing after some ghost in the wilderness over a piece of silver. You will forget this. That is an order." Alara stared at him, at the unyielding wall of his authority, and in that moment something inside her broke. Not her spirit, but the invisible chains that had bound her for 19 years. She had always been the obedient daughter, the quiet girl who did as she was told. But the man who had stolen her locket had also stolen her submission. She gave her father a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of compliance she did not feel. But as she rose from the table and retreated to her room, her mind was already moving. She would not forget. She would not let it go. That night, under the sliver of a crescent moon, Alara moved through the silent house like a shadow. From the pantry, she took a small sack of dried jerky and a water skin. From a chest in the study, she took a compass her father never used. And from a hook in the stables, she took the reins of her mare Willow, a steady creature with a gentle spirit. Her mother had taught her to ride, to feel the rhythm of the horse as an extension of her own body. She saddled Willow with silent practice movements, her heart pounding a steady, resolute rhythm. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but she knew the direction Blackwood's gang had fled north into the broken lands that bordered Apache territory. Riding out of Redemption Creek, she did not look back. The town lights were feeble sparks against the vast, indifferent darkness of the plains. She was alone, underprepared, and chasing a man who was more myth than mortal. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. The pursuit of the locket was no longer just about recovering a memory. It was about claiming a life of her own. The wilderness was a far crueler adversary than Alara had imagined. The sun was relentless, the landscape a monotonous canvas of rock and scrub that offered little shelter and even less water. The tracking skills her mother had taught her were meant for the gentle woods near their old homestead, not this unforgiving terrain. After 2 days, her water was low, her jerky was gone, and the trail left by Blackwood's gang had vanished into a maze of windswept stone. Doubt, a cold and unwelcome companion, began to creep into her heart. On the 3rd day, Desperation drove her to a dried-up riverbed, where she dug frantically in the sand, hoping for a seep of moisture. It was there that they found her. Two men drifters with eyes as empty and hostile as the land itself emerged from the rocks above, their rifles held loosely but with clear intent. "Look what we have here, Jeb." One of them sneered, his teeth stained brown with tobacco. A little lamb, all lost and alone. Fear, sharp and immediate, seized her. She scrambled backward, her hand instinctively going for the small skinning knife on her belt, a pathetic weapon against two armed men. Willow, sensing the danger, shied away with a nervous whinny. Now, no need for that." The second man said, his voice a greasy imitation of reassurance as they advanced on her. "We're just looking for a little company, and whatever supplies you might have." Ilara's world narrowed to their leering faces, the glint of the sun on their rifle barrels. This was it. This was the foolish end to her foolish quest. She raised the knife, her hand trembling, ready to fight for a life she had only just begun to claim. Suddenly, an arrow appeared in the first man's shoulder, so swift and silent it seemed to sprout from his flesh. He cried out a strangled yelp of shock and pain and dropped his rifle. Before the second man could react, a figure descended from the rocks with the fluid grace of a mountain cat. It was Kale, the Apache warrior she had seen from a distance, but never met. His face was set in a grim, focused mask, his movements economical and deadly. He disarmed the second drifter with a powerful shove, sending the man sprawling into the dust. The two drifters, utterly terrified, scrambled to their feet and fled, one of them clutching the arrow shaft still protruding from his shoulder. Silence fell, broken only by Ilara's ragged breathing and the soft whisper of the wind. Kyle stood over her, his chest rising and falling evenly. He looked at the fleeing men, then his dark, unreadable eyes turned to her. He was tall and lean, his body honed by a life lived in harmony with this harsh land. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows and a knife sheathed at his hip. He was not the savage of the settlers' stories. He was a protector, a warrior, whose presence radiated a quiet, formidable strength. "You are far from your fences, settler girl," he said, his voice low and steady, devoid of either warmth or malice. It was a simple statement of fact. Ilara pushed herself to her feet, brushing the dust from her dress, her pride stinging. "I'm not lost," she said, her voice coming out stronger than she felt. "I'm tracking someone." A flicker of interest crossed his face. "The men who came this way 3 days ago. The ones who do not respect boundaries." Ilara nodded, surprised. "Silas Blackwood, you've seen them?" "They crossed onto sacred land." Kale replied, his gaze sweeping over the canyon. "They hunt for gold, but their true purpose is poison. My people track them to ensure they leave our lands." He looked back at her, his expression hardening slightly. "This is not a place for you. Go home." "I'm not turning back." Ilara insisted, her earlier defiance returning. "They took something from me. Something I have to get back." Kale studied her for a long moment, his eyes seeming to peer right through her bravado to the desperate resolve beneath. He saw not a foolish girl, but someone driven by a purpose that resonated with his own people's sense of justice. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Their trail is cold, but they ride heavy. They will need water soon. Come." He turned and began to walk, not waiting to see if she would follow. A reluctant alliance was forged in that moment, born of shared purpose and mutual necessity. As she mounted Willow and followed him, she felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. They traveled in silence for hours, Kyle moving with an effortless certainty that made her own efforts feel clumsy and loud. Late that afternoon, he stopped abruptly. In a shallow ravine hidden beneath a cluster of sun-scorched junipers lay a body. It was one of Blackwood's men, a bullet hole neatly centered in his back. He had been executed. Blackwood does not like loose ends. Cale observed, his voice grim. As Kyle searched the area for tracks, Alara noticed a small, leather-bound book half buried in the sand near the body. It was a journal, its pages warped and stained by water. She picked it up and carefully opened it. Most of the ink had bled, rendering the words unreadable. But on one of the last pages, two things were still legible. A name written in a hurried scrawl. Jedediah Hayes, and a place, Whispering Canyon. She stared at the words, her blood running cold. Why was her father's name in the journal of a dead outlaw? And what was Whispering Canyon? A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air settled over her. The mystery of the locket was deepening its roots, tangling with her family's secrets in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. She showed the journal to Cale. He looked at the name, his expression unreadable, but a new understanding passed between them. Her quest was no longer just her own. The trail to Whispering Canyon was a crucible. It led them out of the open plains and into a fractured landscape of towering red rock formations and deep, shadow-choked gorges. The days were blistering, the nights were cold, and the silence of the land was profound, broken only by the cry of a distant hawk or the scuttling of unseen creatures in the dark. In this vast, empty world, Alara and Cale were forced to rely on each other in ways that transcended the divide between their peoples. Cale taught her how to find water where there seemed to be none, how to read the stories left in the dust, and how to move through the wilderness without leaving a trace. Alara, in turn, shared her meager supplies without hesitation and tended to a cut on his arm with a gentle efficiency that surprised him. Their initial clipped, mistrustful exchanges slowly gave way to a comfortable silence, and then to quiet conversation. One evening, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, Kyle spoke of his people. He told her of the sacred lands. Blackwood's men had trespassed upon lands where the spirits of his ancestors were said to dwell. He spoke not with the anger she expected, but with a deep, sorrowful reverence. This land is not a thing to be owned. He said, his gaze fixed on the flames. It is a part of us, as we are a part of it. Your people see only rock and dirt to be dug up. They do not see its heart. Alara, thinking of her father's relentless drive for profit and property, could not disagree. She found herself telling him about her mother, about the locket, and about the stifling world she had fled. My father believes honor is something you build like a fence, she confessed, her voice soft. But my mother, she believed it was something that grew inside you like a wild flower. Cale listened, his expression thoughtful. Your mother spoke with the wisdom of the earth, he said simply. As their journey continued, the prejudices Alara had been raised with began to crumble. She saw in Cale not a savage, but a man of profound integrity and wisdom. He saw in her not a helpless settler girl, but a woman of quiet courage and fierce determination. A bond of mutual respect, fragile but genuine, was forming between them. They found more evidence of Blackwood's path, but it was not the trail of a simple gang of thieves. They discovered the remains of a small mining claim, its equipment sabotaged, its sluice box smashed to pieces. A day later, they found a spring that had been deliberately dammed with rocks, diverting its precious water away from the lower valley, where a number of small homesteads, all of them on land owned by Jedediah Hayes, depended on it. This is not random, Alara said, staring at the blocked waterway. He's not just running. He's destroying everything connected to my father. He moves with purpose. Kyle agreed, his eyes scanning the surrounding cliffs. This is not the work of a man seeking gold. This is the work of a man seeking revenge. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a disturbing picture. The robbery, the stolen locket, the execution of his own man, the name in the journal, the systematic destruction of her father's assets, it all pointed to a vendetta. Silas Blackwood's goal was not just money. It was the complete and utter ruin of Jedediah Hayes. The thought sent a fresh wave of dread through Alara. Her personal quest for a stolen piece of jewelry had become entangled in a war she didn't understand, a war aimed directly at the heart of her family. Their search for Blackwood led them deeper into the maze of canyons, until they finally found the place mentioned in the journal. Whispering Canyon was a narrow, winding gorge, its high walls carved by wind and water into eerie, ghost-like shapes. The wind moaned through the rock formations, creating a constant, mournful sound that gave the canyon its name. It was a place that felt ancient and secretive, a perfect hideout for a man like Blackwood. And hidden within it, they would find the truth, a truth far more devastating than any outlaw's revenge. Tucked away in a deep recess of Whispering Canyon, almost invisible against the rock, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It had clearly been abandoned for years. The roof sagged, and the door hung from a single leather hinge. It was the kind of place that held secrets. Kyle surveyed the area with a hunter's caution, while Alara pushed open the groaning door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. A single room held a rotting cot, a broken table, and a cold stone fireplace. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry long ago. As Kale stood guard outside, Alara began to search her instincts, telling her that this place was important. Beneath a loose floorboard under the cot, her fingers brushed against the cold, hard metal of a lockbox. It was rusted shut. Kyle forced it open with his knife, the screech of metal echoing in the tense silence. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cloth, was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a single sepia-toned photograph. Alara picked up the photograph with trembling hands. It showed two young men, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They stood before the entrance to a mine, their faces smudged with dirt, but full of hope. One of the men was a younger, leaner version of her father, Jedediah Hayes. The other man she did not recognize, but there was something familiar about his dark, intense eyes. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded, but still legible. It was addressed to a woman named Eleanor. My dearest Eleanor. It began. The strike is bigger than we ever dreamed. Jedediah and I have found the mother lode, soon my love. I will come for you and our boy. We will build a life worthy of your goodness. The days of struggle are almost over. Tell little Silas his father will be home soon, and he will never want for anything again. The letter was signed, Forever yours, Daniel Blackwood. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Silas. She read on her heart, pounding a frantic, sickening rhythm. The letters painted a picture of a deep friendship and a shared dream between her father and Daniel Blackwood. They had been partners equals, pouring their blood and sweat into the mine they called the Eleanor's Hope. Daniel wrote of his trust in Jedediah, calling him a brother. He wrote of the silver locket he had commissioned for his wife, etched with the wildflowers she loved, a promise of the beautiful future that awaited them. The final letter was different. The handwriting was ragged, desperate. It was dated nearly a month after the others. Eleanor, something is wrong. Jedediah has grown quiet, his eyes full of a darkness I do not recognize. He speaks of claims and legal papers I do not understand. There was a tremor in the mine today, a small one, but it has unsettled him. He insists we go back in to secure the main support beam. I do not trust his haste, but he is my partner. I must. The letter ended there, unfinished. The truth, stark and terrible, slammed into Alara with the force of a physical blow. Silas Blackwood was Daniel Blackwood's son. Jedediah Hayes, her father, the righteous founder of Redemption Creek, had not discovered his fortune alone. He had a partner he had betrayed. The cave-in wasn't an accident. Jedediah had left Daniel Blackwood to die in the dark, buried beneath tons of rock and earth so he could claim the entire fortune for himself. He had stolen his partner's life, his dream, and his future. And then, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, he had taken the locket meant for Daniel's wife and given it to his own, Alara's mother. The wealth that had built Redemption Creek, the reputation her father guarded so fiercely, the very foundation of her life. It was all built on a lie, cemented with the blood of an innocent man. Silas Blackwood's vendetta was not about greed or random violence. It was about justice. He was reclaiming the life, the legacy, and the honor that had been stolen from his family. The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything his father had lost and everything her father had stolen. Alara sank to the floor of the dusty cabin, the letters scattered around her like dead leaves. The world had tilted on its axis. The clear lines between good and evil, right and wrong, had dissolved into a murky, unbearable gray. Her father was a thief and a murderer. The villain she was hunting was the victim of an unforgivable crime. And she, Alara Hayes, was the daughter of the man who had started it all. The weight of this knowledge was a crushing stone, and she did not know how she would ever stand up beneath it. The ride back to Redemption Creek was a silent, tormented journey. The truth Alara carried felt like a physical weight pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Cale rode beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. He had seen the truth in her eyes back at the cabin and had asked no questions, offering a silent support that she was profoundly grateful for. When she finally stood before her father in his immaculate study, the letters from the lockbox held tight in her hand, he looked at her with cold fury. "I forbade you from this foolishness." He began, his voice like the crack of a whip. Was his name Daniel? Alara asked, her own voice, shaking but firm. She held up the faded photograph. Daniel Blackwood. The blood drained from Jedediah's face. For a single unguarded moment, she saw not the stern patriarch, but a haunted man and the ghost of his past rising to condemn him. The mask of piety and control shattered, revealing the frightened, greedy man beneath. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the image of his younger self. "From a cabin in Whispering Canyon," Alara said, laying the letters on his polished desk one by one. His letters to his wife. His letters about his son Silas. His letters about you, his partner. Jedediah stared at the evidence of his betrayal, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Cornered by a truth he had buried for 2 decades, he finally broke. He would have squandered it. He snarled, his voice raw with a self-serving justification. Daniel was a dreamer, not a businessman. He would have thrown the money away on foolish ideas. I built this town, I brought civilization to this wasteland. I gave people jobs, a church, a life. What I did for the good of all. You left him to die. Alara said the words tasting like ash in her mouth. You murdered him and stole everything he had. You even stole the locket he had made for his wife and gave it to Mother. Do not speak of your mother, he roared, slamming his fist on the desk. She never knew I gave her a good life, a respected life. A life built on a grave. Alara countered tears of anger and sorrow, finally spilling down her cheeks. You have to make this right. You have to confess to give back what you stole. Jedediah laughed a harsh, bitter sound. Confess, and what then? Destroy everything I have built. Ruin this family, ruin this town. The people here depend on my wealth, on the stability I provide. Exposing me would destroy them as well. The past is the past. It will remain buried. His pride, hard and unyielding, had already rebuilt the wall around his conscience. He would not seek redemption. He would only seek to protect his legacy of lies. As if summoned by his refusal, a commotion erupted from the street outside. Alara rushed to the window. A crowd was gathering in the town square. In the center of it, one of Silas Blackwood's men sat on horseback, holding a white flag. A message from Silas Blackwood. The outlaw shouted, his voice ringing through the tense air. He has a guest, the town doctor. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Dr. Miller was a kind, respected man, a friend to everyone, including Alara. Blackwood wants a word with Jedediah Hayes, in the saloon, at sundown. Jedediah comes alone, or the good doctor pays the price for his sins. And after the doctor, Blackwood will tell the whole town a story about a man named Daniel. The outlaw wheeled his horse around and galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and a wave of panic in his wake. Alara turned from the window, her heart a block of ice. Blackwood had her trapped. He had escalated his plan from destroying her father's assets to threatening innocent lives. She was now caught in an impossible vice: protect her father and his lifetime of sins, or surrender to an outlaw's brutal public justice, a justice that would tear Redemption Creek apart. The choice was no longer just about a locket or a family secret. It was about the soul of the entire town. As sundown approached, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. A fierce wind kicked up from the plains, howling through the streets of Redemption Creek and whipping sand into stinging clouds. The impending sandstorm felt like a physical manifestation of the town's fear, trapping everyone inside, forcing them to bear witness. The saloon was packed, the air thick with the smell of sweat, whiskey, and raw tension. The townspeople huddled together, their faces pale and frightened. Jedediah Hayes stood alone near the bar, his face a grim, unreadable mask, his pride forcing him to face his accuser. Sheriff Miller stood by helplessly, his authority completely eclipsed. Silas Blackwood entered not through the swinging doors, but from a back room, pushing Dr. Miller ahead of him. Blackwood was no longer the phantom outlaw from the bank. His bandana was down, revealing a face that was handsome, but etched with a grief so profound it looked like a permanent part of his features. He held a revolver leveled at Jedediah's chest. "Jedediah," Blackwood said, his voice calm but resonating with 2 decades of cold fury. "It's been a long time." He held up the silver locket. "I believe you know what this is. A gift from a father to a mother. A promise you broke." Jedediah remained silent, his jaw clenched. "For 20 years, I thought my father abandoned my mother and me." Blackwood continued, his voice rising, addressing the silent crowd. "I grew up with the shame of his name. But he didn't abandon us. He was betrayed by his partner, his friend, this man." He gestured with his gun toward Jedediah. "Left my father to die in a collapsed mine so he could steal a fortune in gold. The gold that built this town, your homes, your church. They are all monuments to his greed." A shocked murmur rippled through the saloon. The ticking of the large clock on the wall seemed to grow louder each second, stretching into an eternity. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Blackwood cocked the hammer of his pistol. He stole my father's life. Now I will take his. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, the saloon doors swung open with a crash and Cale stepped inside. The wind billowed his hair and his face was set like stone. He was not alone. Behind him stood a dozen Apache warriors, their presence silencing the room completely. The story is older than that Blackwood fought. Kyle said, his voice cutting through the tension. He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Jedediah. The land your father and Jedediah Hayes mined was never theirs to take. It was sacred Apache land given to them in a trust, a promise that it would be protected. A promise Jedediah Hayes broke when he dug his mine and broke again when he spilled blood upon it. His betrayal was twofold. The weight of this second revelation was staggering. Jedediah's sin was not just against one man, but against an entire people. The foundation of Redemption Creek was not just built on a lie, but on a desecration. All eyes turned to Alara, who had been standing silently in the crowd. This was the moment of truth, the point on which her life and the future of the town would pivot. She could stay silent, let the violence play out, and preserve what was left of her family's name. Or she could choose a different path. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward into the space between her father and his accuser. She did not look at Jedediah. She looked at Silas Blackwood, and then at the faces of the townspeople she had known her entire life. He is right. She said, her voice trembling but clear, ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. All of it. It's true. She did not defend her father. She did not plead for his life. She spoke the truth. My father, Jedediah Hayes, committed a terrible crime against the Blackwood family, and his prosperity was built on a crime against the Apache people. This town, this life, it was all born from a lie. Her confession hung in the air, a brave and terrible act of moral courage. The immediate violence was diffused, replaced by a stunned silence. Vengeance won't undo what was done. She said, her eyes meeting Silas's. It will only create more ghosts. But justice is still possible. She turned to Cale. The land must be returned, all of it. The stolen land will be ceded back to the Apache. Then she looked back at Silas. And my inheritance, the fortune my father stole from yours, will be used to pay restitution. To you. It won't bring him back, but it is the truth. And it's all I have to offer. In the suffocating quiet of the saloon, with the storm raging outside, Alara's choice to sacrifice her own legacy for the sake of justice was not a gunshot, but it was the shot that changed everything. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. As the wind died down, a fragile rain-washed quiet settled over Redemption Creek. The truth, once spoken, could not be taken back. In the saloon, the standoff dissolved not into gunfire, but into the heavy weight of consequence. Jedediah Hayes, publicly shamed and spiritually broken, did not resist when Sheriff Miller, his spine finally stiffened by Alara's courage, stepped forward and took his arm. The founder of Redemption Creek, the pillar of the community, was led away, his empire of lies crumbling around him. His authority was gone, replaced by the pitying and scornful stares of the people he had lorded over for 2 decades. Silas Blackwood slowly lowered his gun. He looked at the defeated man being led away, and then at Alara. The fire of vengeance that had fueled him for so long seemed to flicker and die, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. He had achieved his revenge, but it was Alara's act of truth, not his act of violence, that had delivered the final devastating blow. He walked over to her, his expression a mixture of weary sorrow and a newfound grudging respect. He opened his palm, revealing the silver locket. My mother told me this was a promise of a new life, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. Your father turned it into a lie. He gently pressed it into her hand. You've turned it into the truth. It belongs to your story now, not my story of vengeance. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the saloon. He mounted his horse and rode away, not as a triumphant avenger, but as a man finally unburdened from his past. He disappeared into the now calm twilight, his future uncertain, but his ghost finally laid to rest. The townspeople of Redemption Creek were left to grapple with the new reality. Their founder was a criminal, their prosperity was stolen, and their comfortable prejudices had been shattered. The Apache warriors led by Cale did not gloat or threaten. They simply stood as silent witnesses to the beginning of a long overdue reckoning. The fragile peace of the town was broken, but in its place was an opportunity for something more honest, more just, and ultimately more durable. The work of rebuilding would be slow and painful, but for the first time it would be built on a foundation of truth. Months passed. The seasons turned, and the raw wound of the truth began to scar over healing into something new. Ilara, now the de facto head of her father's estate, found herself in a position of power she had never sought, but now wielded with quiet determination. Jedediah remained in the town jail, a frail and silent man, awaiting the circuit judge stripped of everything but the weight of his guilt. True to her word, Ilara worked tirelessly to make amends. With Cale as her guide and counsel, she navigated the complex legal and social channels to formally return the vast tracts of stolen land to the Apache people. Deeds were redrawn, boundaries were erased, and for the first time, a treaty was signed between the town and the tribe, a treaty based not on condescension, but on mutual respect. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. The settlers, humbled and forced to confront their own complicity, slowly began to see their Apache neighbors not as savages, but as partners in survival. The final scene of this transformation took place on a high ridge overlooking the valley, where the newly drawn border between the settler and Apache lands now lay. Ilara and Cale stood together, watching the sun set its golden light, bathing the landscape in a warm, forgiving glow. Redemption Creek, nestled in the valley below, looked smaller, humbler, but more peaceful than it ever had before. Ilara held the silver locket in her hand, its surface gleaming. For weeks she had debated what to do with it. It was a symbol of so much pain, of her father's betrayal, of Silas's loss, of her mother's unwitting part in a lie. But it was also a symbol of her journey, of her fight for the truth. Instead of putting it around her neck, she knelt down at the base of a young sapling they had planted on the borderline that day. With her bare hands, she dug a small hole in the rich earth and gently placed the locket inside. She covered it over, burying the painful past and planting a new future. It was a symbol of letting go, of cultivating something new and hopeful from the soil of old sorrows. As they stood watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains, a rider approached from the town below. He carried a letter for Ilara, its postmark from a distant territory she didn't recognize. She opened it, her brow furrowed in confusion. The letter was from Silas Blackwood. Miss Hayes. It read, I write this from a place where no one knows my name. I heard what you did for the Apache, for the town. When I left Redemption Creek, I was an empty man, my revenge having brought me no peace. But news of your actions reached me. Your courage to choose justice over vengeance, truth over loyalty, gave me something to believe in. It showed me that a life can be rebuilt not on the ashes of the past, but on the foundation of a better future. You inspired me to start a new life free from the ghosts I carried for so long. For that I am in your debt. A slow smile touched Alara's lips. She folded the letter, a sense of complete closure washing over her. Her act had not just healed her own world. It had sent ripples of hope out into a world she couldn't even see. She looked at Kale, whose steady presence had been her strength through it all. Their bond, forged in the harshness of the wilderness and tested by the fire of truth, was now the bedrock of this new peace. They looked out at the horizon together, at the darkening sky full of nascent stars, ready to build a better future side by side.